The wagon wheels rattled over frozen earth. Dust Hollow's main street stretched like a scar across Wyoming territory, November 1878. Wind carried the bite of winter, rattling loose shutters, stirring dust devils between the storefronts. Sarah May stepped into Carter's General and Pharmacy. 28 years old, practical dress buttoned to her throat, medical bag clutched tight. The scent of liniment and dried herbs hit her nostrils. Her boots tapped worn floorboards as she moved toward the counter. Two women by the shelves spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Did you hear who just walked in?" The first woman's voice carried like a church bell. The midwife with no children. Sarah's fingers tightened around her supply list. Yarrow, pennyroyal, willow bark. The same herbs she'd used to save a dozen babies this year alone. The second woman snorted. A midwife with no child of her own? If she'd been a mother, maybe she'd know more than herbs and scissors. Sarah kept her eyes on the jars. Her chest tightened, but her breath stayed even. She'd heard worse. If folks were smart, the first woman raised her voice, they'd keep their babies far from her. Heaven help any child she touches. The shop door swung open. Heavy boots crossed the floor. A broad-shouldered cowboy stepped up beside Sarah. Weathered from the open range hat dusted with frost, eyes the color of late summer wheat. From near the stove, a rangy man called out with a smirk. "Well now, if it ain't the baby doctor who never had a baby," he spat into the brass spittoon. "If you're so good at bringing them into the world, why don't you get yourself one first?" Chuckles rippled through the store. Sarah turned to him. Her voice came calm and low. "You're in my way, mister. Step aside." Before he could speak, the cowboy's voice cut in, steady, carrying like a whip crack. "Now that's enough." His gaze pinned the jeering man. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his Colt. "She saved more lives than everyone in this room put together. If you've got a problem, take it outside and keep walking until you find someone who will listen." The shop went still. Even the wind seemed to pause. The man muttered and moved aside. The cowboy tipped his hat. "Luke Callahan. I run the Callahan Ranch out past Red Creek." "I know the place," Sarah replied. Luke stepped to the counter, laying down coins. "Add her supplies to my bill." "That's not necessary," Sarah began. "It is." Luke's voice softened, but only slightly. "My boy's been coughing for days. My girl, she needs more than I can give alone. You'd be doing me a service." His gaze was steady, without pity. Sarah considered refusing, but the thought of her patient in the valley tipped the scales. "I will come." Luke picked up her parcels and handed them to her. "Then let's get you out of here before someone decides to start talking again." The cold wind caught the door behind them, slamming it shut. Inside, no one spoke. Outside, for the first time in weeks, the weight of the town's whispers felt lighter. The ride was quiet, just the creak of saddle leather and the occasional whinny from Luke's gelding. Sarah kept her gaze on the horizon where golden grasslands rolled into cottonwoods. When the ranch came into view, it was larger than she'd imagined. 2 barns, a wide corral, a weathered pine house with a porch stretching like open arms. Fences ran toward the hills. Cattle grazed in the distance. Luke dismounted first. "Welcome to Callahan Ranch." He nodded toward the porch where 2 small figures stood. Matthew, about 6, hair a little long, shirt untucked. Ellie, no more than 3, clinging to his arm. Both barefoot faces streaked with dust. "This is Miss May," Luke called. "She's going to be staying for a while." Matthew's gaze was cautious, measuring. Ellie hid behind him, peeking out only when Sarah smiled. "Hello," Sarah said gently. "I hear you two keep your papa very busy." Matthew's lips twitched, held back a smile. Ellie just gripped her brother tighter. Inside the house was warm, but bore the mark of a man alone. Boots by the door, dishes stacked, the fire low. "I wasn't sure how long you'd stay," Luke said, leading her down the hall. "But I had the spare room cleaned." Sarah paused in the doorway. The room was small but bright, a quilt folded at the bed's foot. On the table, a clay jar of wildflowers blazed in vivid reds and yellows. In the corner sat a worn wooden rocking chair. "My wife used to sit there," Luke said quietly. "Thought you might like it for evenings." She turned to him. He was already looking away. "Thank you," she said softly. The room felt like more than a place to rest. It felt like an offering. That evening, Sarah unpacked her small satchel. She had planned to stay only a few days, but as she moved in the kitchen, later preparing simple supper, she could feel the emptiness in the house, the kind no sturdy walls could hide. After supper, Ellie climbed into the rocking chair, traced the armrest with small fingers. "Mama used to sit here," she murmured. I imagine she was very kind, Sarah said, her chest tightening. Matthew, clearing dishes without being asked, looked up. She was, but she's been gone a long time now. Luke returned from the barn. His coat carried the cold night air. His eyes moved from his children to Sarah, then to the chair. He gave a small nod as if to say she was in the right place. Later, with the children asleep, Sarah stepped onto the porch. The prairie stretched under a sky scattered with stars, the air sharp with sage. She remembered another porch, another home, before fever took her husband, before the winter night when her child came too soon to survive. She had buried both within weeks, her heart closing over like a wound that never healed. From then on, she had delivered other women's children, never letting herself belong to any family again. But tonight, hearing the faint creak of the rocking chair inside, seeing the wildflowers on the table, she felt something she hadn't allowed in years. An unspoken invitation. For reasons she couldn't name, she didn't push it away. For part 3, belonging. It did not take long for the whispers to spread. By the end of her first week at the Callahan Ranch, Sarah could feel them like a draft under a closed door. At the general store, men paused mid-conversation as she entered. In the churchyard on Sunday, the pastor's wife smiled politely, but Sarah caught the quick glance toward another woman, the faint shake of a head. In the saloon, the talk was less polite. Luke Callahan's got the midwife without a family playing house out there, a ranch hand said over whiskey. Wouldn't surprise me if she's after his land, another replied. Even in the pharmacy, Sarah felt it, the weight of eyes following her. She kept her chin level, her voice steady with the shopkeeper. But by the time she reached her wagon, her jaw ached from holding it tight. At the ranch, life settled into rhythm. Matthew had stopped being cautious around her. He sought her out now, not with questions about chores, but with stories of things that mattered to him. The hidden spot by the creek where wild blackberries grew. The time he and his father rescued a calf caught in mud. How he sometimes still dreamed of his mother. Sarah listened without rushing him, never prying, letting him set the pace. Ellie grew bolder too. Most nights she climbed into Sarah's lap after supper, head resting against her chest, small body relaxing in a way that spoke of safety. Sometimes she fell asleep there, her breathing keeping time with the fire's crackle. Luke noticed. He noticed how Matthew laughed more easily, how Ellie hummed as she played, how the air in the house felt warmer even when the wind was sharp outside. And he noticed how Sarah fit into their lives without forcing her place, how she moved through kitchen, barn, and fields as though she'd always belonged. One evening, they sat down to a meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Nothing fancy, but the table was full. So was the sound of conversation. Luke caught himself smiling, the kind that came without thinking. The sound of hooves crunching on frozen earth broke through the easy talk. Luke's smile faded. He rose and stepped to the window. In the shadows beyond the barn, figures moved. 4 men sliding through darkness like they owned it. The leader was broad with a scar running from temple to jaw. Briggs, the kind of man who made his living where law came slow if at all. They moved toward the side door of the barn. Luke was finishing evening chores when he heard the crunch of boots on frozen dirt, where no boots should be. He stepped into the alley between barn and corral. "Evening, Briggs," Luke said, his voice low but carrying. The big man stopped. His companions fanned out just enough to look like a wall. "We're here for a word with your guest," Briggs replied, his tone oily. "She's sleeping," Luke said, "and I don't take kindly to folks prowling my yard after dark." Briggs grinned without humor. "Best for her to leave before folks get more riled up. Ain't good for a man's reputation keeping company like that." Luke stepped forward, until there was barely a yard between them. The lamplight from the barn caught the steel in his eyes. "My reputation is my own concern." He glanced toward the corral where a gate hung open, the wind swinging it just enough to show a length of rawhide rope looped over the post. "You've been sloppy tonight." One of the younger men shifted uneasy. "You came to scare her?" Luke continued, his voice quiet. "But I reckon you'd rather I not ride into town tomorrow and tell the sheriff whose boot tracks I found by my barn. Tracks I can follow straight to the bunkhouse you're staying in." Briggs's smirk faltered. Luke didn't need to raise his voice. He just let the silence stretch until the cold seemed to seep deeper into their skin. "Now," Luke said, tilting his head toward the road. "You can walk out of here and think better of your choices, or you can stay, and I'll make sure every ranch within 50 miles hears how you tried to sneak into a man's home after his children were asleep." No one moved for a long breath. Then Briggs spat into the snow. "Come on," he muttered, turning away. The others followed. boots crunching until the sound faded into night. Luke watched until they were gone, then shut the barn door, sliding the bolt into place. He walked the perimeter of the house once, checking latches, making sure shutters were secure. Inside, Sarah was in the small parlor, a book open in her lap. She looked up as he entered. All done in the barn? Luke nodded, pulling off his coat. All done. He didn't mention Briggs, or the open gate, or the rope. There was no need to trouble her with it. Instead, he set another log on the fire and made a mental note to oil the hinges on the porch door in the morning. It's part 4, the fever breaks. The snow had been falling since morning, heavy flakes drifting down from a sky the color of lead. By nightfall, drifts lay deep against the porch rails. The wind howled across open prairie. Inside, the house was warm, but a different kind of chill had settled over it. Ellie was sick. It had started with a cough 2 days ago. Small, sharp. Nothing that seemed too worrying at first, but by evening her little chest worked harder for each breath. Her cheeks flushed with fever. Now she lay curled beneath quilts, sweat beading along her brow, her lips dry and pale. Luke hovered near the bed, his large hands useless against the heat radiating from his daughter's small frame. Snow's too deep to ride for the doctor, he said, voice rough. Sarah had already set her bag on the table, was sorting through jars and cloths. Then we do what we can here, she answered, calm but quick. Get me clean water and stoke the fire. She needs warmth, but not too much heat. Matthew stood in the doorway, eyes wide, clutching the bedpost. Is Ellie going to be all right? Sarah turned to him, her tone steady. She will if we work together. Fetch more kindling and stay close. Through the long hours of night, Sarah worked without pause. She brewed infusions from dried willow bark and woundwort, the steam carrying bitter scent through the room. She cooled cloths in a basin, laying them against Ellie's forehead. Replaced them before heat could build again. When Ellie's breathing grew too shallow, Sarah lifted her gently, held her upright to ease the strain on her lungs. She rubbed the girl's back in slow circles, murmured soft words that were more rhythm than meaning. Luke brought water, then more wood, then sat helplessly in the chair beside the bed. I've buried enough family, he said hoarsely. I can't. You won't, Sarah cut in firmly. Not tonight. The hours dragged. Outside, wind battered the walls. Inside, only the crackle of fire, the clink of spoons against glass in Ellie's ragged breasts. Near midnight, the fever spiked. Ellie whimpered, twisted weakly against the covers. Sarah soaked a fresh cloth and pressed it to the girl's neck. Her own pulse quickening. She had seen too many children lose this fight. The memory of her own baby, tiny, fragile, slipping away in her arms, threatened to break her focus. She forced it back, kept her hands steady. Stay with me, little one, she whispered. You're not going anywhere. Luke shifted beside her, his hand brushing the edge of the blanket. Tell me what to do. Keep the water fresh, she said, and talk to her. She knows your voice. So he did. He told Ellie about spring calves, about the mare that would foal soon, about the creek thawing and flowers she liked to pick. His voice was low and steady, filling the space between storms of coughing. The night wore on. Sarah measured doses carefully, coaxed Ellie to swallow small sips. She placed her hand against the girl's chest, feeling for each breath, willing them to keep coming. Just before dawn, something shifted. The tight, shallow gasps eased into slower, deeper breaths. The fever's heat began to fade, replaced by damp coolness against Sarah's palm. She sat back, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She's past the worst, she said softly. Luke's head lifted, eyes searching her face. You sure? Sarah nodded. She's out of danger now. She'll need rest, but she's going to be all right. Luke's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at his daughter, then back at Sarah. In the dim light of the fire, his eyes shone, red-rimmed raw with relief. Thank you, he said, the words rough as if they had to push past something heavy in his chest. Sarah brushed a strand of hair from Ellie's damp forehead. She's a strong one. You've raised her well. But when she glanced up, Luke was still watching her. Not just with gratitude, but with something deeper. Something unspoken that lingered even after the storm outside began to fade. The days that followed brought quiet change to the rhythm of the house. Matthew, once guarded and watchful, began to seek Sarah out with stories that mattered to him. Ellie grew bolder, climbing into Sarah's lap most nights after supper, her small body relaxing in a way that spoke of safety and trust. Luke noticed. He noticed how Matthew laughed more easily, how Ellie hummed as she played, how the air in the house felt warmer even when the wind was sharp outside. And he noticed how Sarah fit into their lives without forcing her place. One evening, they sat down to a meal of roast beef potatoes and fresh bread. The table was full, and so was the sound of conversation. Luke caught himself smiling, the kind that came without thinking. The sound of hooves crunching on frozen earth broke through the easy talk. Luke's smile faded. He rose and stepped to the window. Two wagons had pulled up outside. A group of well-dressed men and women climbed down. At their center stood Mr. Whitmore, tall, silver-haired, carrying himself like a man used to getting what he wanted. His daughter Clara Whitmore followed behind, her gloved hands folded neatly, eyes scanning the house with quiet calculation. Luke opened the door before they could knock. "Evening," he said flatly. Whitmore tipped his hat. "Evening, Luke. We thought we might have a word." Inside, Sarah had gathered Ellie into her arms. Matthew stood close beside her. Whitmore stepped forward. "We hear you've taken in a guest. While I'm sure her intentions are good, there are those in town who believe a more fitting arrangement would benefit your family." He gestured toward Clara. "My daughter is prepared to help raise your children, manage your home, and see to the ranch's affairs." Luke's jaw tightened. "You're here to tell me who belongs in my home?" Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to offer you a choice that will spare you a good deal of trouble." Luke's gaze moved from Whitmore to Clara, then back again. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "The only trouble I see is a man thinking he has the right to decide my family for me." Clara Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think keeping a midwife with no ties, no family is better for your children than giving them a mother who—" "She is their mother," Luke said, cutting her off. The words hung in the air, clear and solid as winter sky. Behind him, Sarah's breath caught. Luke stepped forward, closing the space between himself and Whitmore. "The woman in that room is part of my family. She has earned her place here in ways that have nothing to do with your standards or your daughter's ambitions. Whatever business you thought you came here for, it ends now." For a moment, no one moved. Then Whitmore's expression shifted, the charm slipping from his face. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the wagon. Clara followed, her chin high, but her steps quick. Luke watched them go, the cold air sharp against his skin. When he stepped back inside, Matthew was grinning openly. Ellie still clung to Sarah's neck. Sarah met Luke's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that whatever storms the town might send their way, the walls of this house would hold. Part 6, the proposal. The trail to truth was not long. Luke found it in the same place most gossip in Dust Hollow started over a bottle in the saloon. He stood at the far end of the bar, hat low, listening, while two ranch hands traded news they shouldn't have spoken aloud. "Told Briggs he'd get a nice payday if that midwife packed her bags," one said, chuckling. "Yeah, richest family in the valley. Old man Whitmore, once his daughter settled at Callahan Ranch, says it's time Luke had a proper woman under his roof." Luke let the words sink in. So that was it. Briggs was no more than a hired threat, a piece in someone else's scheme. The next morning, Luke went to see Sheriff Dawson. The two men sat in the back office, a single lamp burning frost thick on the window panes. "I want them caught where everyone can see it," Luke said. Dawson leaned back, chewing the end of a pencil. "That means we make it public. But it has to look real, Luke." "It will," Luke replied. "I just need you and your deputy ready to step in after I take the sting out of it." 3 days later, word spread that Sarah May would be in town to collect medical supplies for winter births. The news moved faster than it should have, exactly as Luke intended. On the appointed morning, Sarah walked the boardwalk toward Carter's General and Pharmacy, unaware of the bait she carried simply by being there. Luke lingered near the blacksmith's, his eyes tracking every movement in the street. The sheriff leaned against the post outside his office, pretending to roll a cigarette. Briggs appeared from the far end of the street, his long coat swinging with each step. Two of his men flanked him, hands loose near their gun belts. They fanned out just enough to push passers-by to the edges of the street. Luke's heartbeat slowed, his breathing even. He watched Briggs's eyes fix on Sarah's back. The big man called out, voice carrying over the winter air. "Hey, midwife." Sarah froze, half turning. "You got a bad habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," Briggs said, stepping closer. "Some folks think maybe you need a reminder to leave before worse comes along." His hand dropped to his revolver. The street went still. Luke moved. He stepped from the blacksmith's doorway in one fluid motion, his own Colt clearing leather almost before the thought had formed. The crack of the shot split the silence, echoing off the wooden fronts of buildings. Briggs's revolver flew from his hand, spinning into the snow with a dull thud. The big man clutched his wrist, swearing. Luke's voice was calm, almost cold. "That's enough. Every face in the street was turned toward them now. Shopkeepers in doorways, women clutching baskets, cow hands frozen mid-step. You draw on her again, Luke went on, and next time I will not aim for the gun. Sheriff Dawson strode forward then, his badge catching the pale sun. Briggs, you and your boys just bought yourselves a trip to the jail. Seems you've been making trouble for hire, and I've got witnesses to prove it. The deputies moved in, binding Briggs's hands and marching the men away. Luke turned to Sarah. You all right? She nodded slowly, still staring at the revolver half buried in snow. I think so. He tipped his hat, his gaze steady on hers. Then let's get your supplies and head home. As they walked toward the pharmacy, the murmurs began. Not the sharp-edged whispers Sarah had grown used to, but a different kind of talk. She caught fragments. Never seen shooting that clean. Stood up for her. Guess she's not what folks were saying. For the first time since she had set foot in Dust Hollow, the eyes on her felt less like judgment and more like something else. Something closer to respect. Behind them, the snow in the street still held the imprint of Briggs's revolver, a silent marker of the moment the tide had begun to turn. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke and apple cider. Lanterns swung from the eaves of storefronts, casting warm light over the crowded main street. The Harvest Festival had drawn nearly every soul from Dust Hollow. Ranchers in their Sunday coats, children darting between stalls, the church choir singing near the gazebo. Sarah walked beside Luke, her hands tucked into her shawl, still unused to the easy glances and nods she now received. Since the trouble with Briggs and the Whitmores, the sharp whispers had faded, replaced with something quieter, almost curious. Still, she had not expected Luke to bring her here tonight. They stopped near the center of the street where the townfolk gathered between the bandstand and the general store. Music drifted on the air. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then Luke turned to her, his eyes steady. Stay here a moment, he said, and stepped up onto the low platform beside the bandstand. The conversations around them dimmed, people turning to see the tall rancher standing in the lamplight. Evening, folks, Luke began, his voice carrying without strain. I won't take much of your time, but there's something I need to say where everyone can hear it. Sarah felt a flutter of unease. She stood rooted, the eyes of half the town now glancing between her and the man on the platform. Luke reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small worn box. He opened it, and inside lay a gold ring. Simple but elegant, the band softened by years of wear. My mother wore this ring for most of her life, Luke said, his voice steady but warm. She told me once that it wasn't the gold that mattered. It was what it stood for. Family, loyalty, the promise to stand by each other through every hard season. His gaze swept the crowd, then found Sarah's. I've been fortunate in my life, but I've also lost more than I ever wanted to. And I know there's been talk about the woman who came to my ranch, about whether she belongs there. He paused, let the silence stretch. So I'm telling you now she does. More than anyone could understand from the outside looking in. He stepped down from the platform and crossed to her, the crowd parting silently. Stopping before her, he held the ring between them. Sarah May, he said, his voice low enough for her alone at first, then rising so all could hear. My mother's ring is the one thing I never thought I would give away. But tonight I'm giving it to the woman I trust to keep my family whole. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint creak of a lantern swaying overhead. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the street. But more than that, she felt the weight of Luke's words. Solid, unshaken. Her hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. Luke's eyes didn't leave hers. You've stood with me through more than I had any right to ask. Now I'm asking you to stay. Not because my children need you, but because I do. Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a soft sigh. Another person cleared their throat. Then silence swept over the street again, deep and absolute. Sarah felt her throat tighten, but she managed a nod. I will, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried. Luke's mouth curved into the smallest of smiles before he turned, keeping her hand in his to face the crowd. This is my family, he said simply. No one spoke against it. A few hats tipped in quiet respect. Someone near the bandstand began clapping, slow at first, then joined by others, until the sound rolled through the street like distant thunder. Sarah stood there with the ring warm against her skin, the noise of the crowd fading into background. For the first time since she'd come to Dust Hollow, she didn't feel like she was standing on borrowed ground. Primary epilogue, spring wedding. The spring sun spilled gold across Callahan Ranch, setting the creek aglow and brightening fields dotted with wildflowers. Chairs stood beneath the old cottonwood near the barn, plain but adorned with garlands of fresh blooms. Friends from town, neighboring ranchers, and the sheriff spoke quietly, their voices drifting on the warm breeze. Inside, Sarah stood before her small mirror, smoothing the skirt of her cream-colored dress. Soft cotton with a touch of lace. It felt right. For a moment, the woman staring back at her seemed far removed from the newcomer who had once stepped into Dust Hollow, carrying nothing but whispers and scorn. A knock came. Matthew peeked in. "Ready, Mama." The word still caught her. She smiled. "I am." He offered his arm with solemn pride. "Then let's go." They stepped outside into sunlight. Ellie, in a pale yellow dress, skipped ahead, scattering petals from a small basket, her laughter bright as morning. Matthew matched Sarah's pace, leading her toward Luke beneath the cottonwood. Luke stood tall in his best shirt and dark vest, hat in hand. When their eyes met, his faint smile told her everything. The ceremony was simple. The pastor spoke of commitment through seasons, how the land endured winter, trusting in spring. Sarah heard the words, but her gaze stayed on Luke, on how his eyes never left hers. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Luke kissed her with quiet reverence. The world seemed to fade. Applause broke out, hats lifted. The children ran forward. Ellie clung to Sarah's waist. Matthew grinned up at them, pride shining. Later, when chairs were cleared and the sun sank toward the hills, Sarah and Luke stood on the porch, watching the last guest ride off. The air smelled of cut hay and honeysuckle. Luke stepped closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. His thumb brushed the fabric. Small, almost unconscious, yet full of meaning, gratitude, trust, love unspoken. She met his gaze. It was the same steady look he'd given the night he faced down Briggs, the same when he'd placed his mother's ring on her finger. In the quiet, she felt the truth of her journey. She thought of the words once whispered behind her back, "Midwife with no children." Then she thought of Matthew's hand on her arm, Ellie's laughter, Luke's touch. "I used to be called a midwife with no children," she said softly. "Now I am a mother, a wife, and the woman a Western man was willing to draw his gun for just to protect my honor." Luke's quiet smile lit his eyes. He squeezed her shoulder once before they turned toward the house, the porch light spilling warm across the threshold of their new life. And that's how Sarah May went from whispered scorn to becoming the heart of the Callahan family, proving that love, loyalty, and courage can turn even the harshest frontier into a true home.